Adolf Eichmann, most elusive of the major Nazi war criminals, will be tried in what some people call the trial of the century.
Da blieb mir ja nichts anderes übrig, da musste ich gehorchen, was befohlen war.
The architect of genocide, the Adolf Eichmann story. In the spring of 1960, a seemingly ordinary man lived a quiet life in the suburbs of Buenos Aires, Argentina. He went by the name Ricardo Clement. Every evening, he took the same bus home from his job at Mercedes-Benz, walking the same route through an open field to reach his modest house on Garibaldi Street. To his neighbors, he was unremarkable, forgettable even. But Ricardo Clement was living a lie. His real name was Adolf Eichmann, and he was one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, responsible for orchestrating the deportation of millions of Jews to their deaths in Nazi extermination camps. This is the story of how an ordinary man became the embodiment of systematic evil, how he evaded justice for 15 years, and how his capture and trial would fundamentally change the world's understanding of the Holocaust. The making of a bureaucrat. Adolf Eichmann was born on March 19, 1906, in Solingen, Germany, into a middle-class Calvinist family. His father, Adolf Karl Eichmann, worked as a bookkeeper, and his mother, Maria, was a housewife. There was nothing in young Adolf's early years that would suggest the monstrous role he would later play in history. In 1913, when Adolf was 7 years old, his father took a position as commercial manager for the Linz Tramway and Electrical Company in Austria, and the family relocated to Linz. Tragedy struck early when Eichmann's mother died in 1916. His father remarried a devout Protestant woman named Maria Zarzel, who brought 2 sons of her own into the family. Young Adolf attended the Kaiser Franz Joseph Staatsoberrealschule in Linz, the same high school that Adolf Hitler had attended 17 years earlier. This coincidence would prove fateful, though neither could have known it at the time. Eichmann was not a distinguished student. He played the violin, participated in sports, and joined a Wandervogel scouting group that included older boys involved in right-wing militias. But his poor academic performance led his father to withdraw him from the school and enroll him in a vocational college for engineering. Even there, Eichmann failed to complete his studies, leaving without a degree. The 1920s were uncertain economic times in Europe, and Eichmann drifted through a series of jobs. He worked briefly for his father's mining company, then as a sales clerk for a radio company, and finally as a travelling salesman for the vacuum oil company in Upper Austria. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable young man, struggling to find his place in the world. But the political landscape of Europe was shifting dramatically, and Eichmann was about to find his purpose. During his time as a travelling salesman, Eichmann began reading newspapers published by the Nazi Party. He joined the Jungfrontkämpfervereinigung, the youth section of a right-wing veterans movement. The Nazi Party's platform spoke to something within him: the rejection of the Weimar Republic, opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, radical anti-Semitism and anti-Bolshevism. They promised a strong central government, increased living space for Germanic peoples, and the formation of a national community based on race. On April 1st, 1932, at the urging of a family friend and local SS leader named Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Eichmann joined the Austrian Nazi Party. He was member number 889,895. 7 months later, his membership in the SS was confirmed. For the first time in his aimless life, Adolf Eichmann had found a sense of belonging and purpose. Rise through the ranks. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power in Germany in January 1933, the Austrian government banned the Nazi Party. Like many Austrian Nazis, Eichmann found himself jobless, losing his position at Vacuum Oil due to staffing cutbacks during the Great Depression. These circumstances pushed him to flee Austria for Bavaria, Germany. Eichmann joined the Austrian Legion, an organization for Nazi Party members from Austria, where he underwent military training. In 1934, with the rank of SS Sergeant, he was assigned to a unit at Dachau concentration camp, and then transferred to the security service, known as the SD in Berlin. This assignment would prove to be his big break, as he would later describe it. At the SD headquarters, Eichmann was initially assigned to a section dealing with Freemasons, organizing seized ritual objects and creating card indexes of German Freemasons. He even prepared an anti-Masonic exhibition that proved extremely popular, attracting high-ranking visitors, including Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler. But it was his next assignment that would define his career. Baron Leopold von Mildenstein invited Eichmann to join the Jewish department, Section 2/112 of the SD. Eichmann threw himself into this work with characteristic enthusiasm. He studied Jewish organizations, read extensively about Zionism, and even learned rudimentary Hebrew and Yiddish. He gained a reputation as a specialist in Jewish and Zionist matters, an expertise that was entirely self-taught and motivated by his commitment to Nazi ideology. In 1937, Eichmann made an inspection tour of British Mandatory Palestine with his superior, Herbert Hagen, travelling with forged press credentials. They met with Feivel Polkis, an agent of the Haganah, to discuss the possibility of Jewish emigration from Germany to Palestine. The mission was ultimately unsuccessful, but it demonstrated Eichmann's growing involvement in what the Nazis called the Jewish question. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in what became known as the Anschluss. Eichmann personally led a raid on the Jewish cultural community offices in Vienna. Then came his moment of terrible innovation. He was tasked with organizing a central office for Jewish emigration in Vienna, which opened officially on August 20th, 1938. The Vienna model, as it became known, was brutally efficient. Jewish community organizations were placed under SD supervision and forced to facilitate their own people's emigration. Funding came from money seized from other Jews and from donations from overseas, all placed under SD control. The system used violence and economic pressure to coerce Jews into leaving Austria. According to internal estimates, the central office facilitated the forced emigration of 110,000 Austrian Jews between August 1938 and June 1939. The success of the Vienna operation created a template for a Reich-wide approach. In October 1939, Eichmann was appointed to lead the Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Berlin. He also created a similar office in Prague after the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. Eichmann had found his calling, and his superiors recognized his efficiency and initiative. From emigration to extermination. The outbreak of World War II on September 1st, 1939, marked a fundamental shift in Nazi Jewish policy. Within weeks, the emphasis changed from forced emigration to forced deportation. The victims would no longer be pushed to leave German-controlled territories, but would be concentrated in specific areas, with their ultimate fate still undecided. After the foundation of the Reich Security Main Office, known as the RSHA, in September 1939, Eichmann moved from the SD to the Gestapo. He became director of RSHA Section IVD-4, dealing with what was euphemistically called clearing activities. After March 1941, he became director of Section 4B4, the Jewish Affairs Department. Eichmann's first attempt at mass deportation came shortly after the war began. He organized the deportation of approximately 3,500 Jews from Moravia and Vienna to Nisko on the San River in occupied Poland. The deportees were essentially abandoned in an open meadow with no water and little food. Barracks were planned but never built. Many were driven by the SS into Soviet-occupied territory, while others were placed in nearby labor camps. Though the operation was called off due to transportation needs for military purposes, Eichmann's superiors were satisfied with his initiative. In October 1940, Eichmann organized the deportation of nearly 7,000 Jews from Baden and Saarpfalz to unoccupied areas of France. The conditions were horrific. On many of the deportation trains during this period, up to a third of the deportees died in transit. Yet Eichmann's primary concern, as revealed in his correspondence, was not the human suffering, but achieving the deportations economically and with minimal disruption to Germany's military operations. Jews were being concentrated into ghettos in major cities across occupied Europe. The conditions in these ghettos were deliberately designed to be lethal. Severe overcrowding, poor sanitation, and lack of food resulted in high death rates. But this was still not the final solution. The Nazi leadership was still debating what to do with Europe's Jews. In August 1940, Eichmann released a memorandum titled Reich Security Main Office, Madagascar Project, proposing the resettlement of 1 million Jews per year for 4 years to the island of Madagascar. When Germany failed to defeat Britain and control of the Atlantic remained out of reach, the Madagascar plan was shelved. Hitler continued to mention it until February 1942, but it was clear that a different solution was needed. Everything changed with the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Special task forces called Einsatzgruppen followed the German army into conquered areas, rounding up and killing Jews, communist officials, and ranking members of the Communist Party. Eichmann was one of the officials who received regular, detailed reports of these mass shootings. The systematic murder of Jews had begun, but it was decentralized, chaotic, and psychologically difficult for the perpetrators. According to Eichmann's later testimony, sometime in mid-September 1941, his superior, Reinhard Heydrich, told him that Hitler had ordered the physical extermination of all Jews in German-controlled Europe. Eichmann would later say at his trial, "I never saw a written order. All I know is that Heydrich told me the Führer ordered the physical extermination of the Jews. The decision had been made at the highest levels, and now it needed to be implemented systematically and efficiently. This was where Adolf Eichmann would play his most crucial and terrible role." The Wannsee Conference. On January 20, 1942, a conference was held at a villa in the Wannsee district of Berlin. Reinhard Heydrich had convened a meeting of administrative leaders from across the Nazi regime to coordinate planning for what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. This meeting would go down in history as the Wannsee Conference, and Adolf Eichmann played a central role in its organization and execution. In preparation for the conference, Eichmann drafted a list for Heydrich showing the numbers of Jews in various European countries and prepared statistics on emigration. He attended the conference himself, oversaw the stenographer who took the minutes, and prepared the official distributed record of the meeting. In his covering letter, Heydrich specified that Eichmann would act as his liaison with all the government departments involved in implementing the final solution. At the conference, the assembled officials discussed the logistics of genocide with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. They determined how Jews would be identified, concentrated, and transported to killing centers in occupied Poland. The language used was deliberately euphemistic. They spoke of evacuation and resettlement rather than murder, but everyone present understood what was being planned: the systematic annihilation of 11 million European Jews. Following the Wannsee Conference, Eichmann's role became pivotal. He was not a policymaker. The decisions came from higher-ranking officials like Heydrich, Himmler, and ultimately Hitler. But Eichmann was the operations manager of genocide. His office, RSHA Section 4B4, was responsible for the logistics that made the Holocaust possible. Eichmann's department collected information on Jews in each area, organized the seizure of their property, and most critically, arranged for and scheduled the trains that would carry victims to their deaths. His office maintained constant contact with the Foreign Office, as Jews from conquered nations like France and the Netherlands could not as easily be stripped of their possessions and deported. Eichmann held regular meetings in his Berlin offices with his department members working across occupied Europe and travelled extensively to visit concentration camps and ghettos. Under Eichmann's supervision, large-scale deportations began almost immediately to extermination camps at Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz. The genocide was codenamed Operation Reinhard in honor of Heydrich, who died in June 1942 from wounds suffered in an assassination attempt. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the same man who had recruited Eichmann into the Nazi Party, succeeded Heydrich as head of the RSHA. In 1942, Eichmann and his network of subordinates, known as Eichmann's Men, organized the deportation of Jews from Slovakia, the Netherlands, France and Belgium. In 1943 and 1944, the Jews of Greece and northern Italy followed. Eichmann's men included his deputy Rolf Günther and operatives like Alois Brunner, Theodor Dannecker, and Dieter Wisliceni, who carried out deportations across occupied Europe. Throughout this period, Eichmann proved to be not merely a functionary following orders, but a resourceful and proactive manager. He secured scarce cattle cars and equipment for deportations at a time when such resources were desperately needed for the German war effort. He repeatedly devised innovative solutions to overcome obstacles. When told something was impossible, he found a way to make it happen. His efficiency in the machinery of death was remarkable and horrifying. Hungary, the final catastrophe. In March 1944, Germany invaded and occupied Hungary. For Hungary's 725,000 Jews, who had remained relatively unharmed until that point, this spelled doom. Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest on the same day as the invasion, accompanied by top members of his staff and 500 or 600 members of the SD, SS and security police. This was the only time during the war that Eichmann involved himself directly on the ground in the deportation process, and he did so with devastating efficiency. In the last week of April 1944, Eichmann toured northeastern Hungary to assess the situation. In May, he visited Auschwitz to review the preparations for receiving Hungarian Jews. The commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, would later testify at the Nuremberg trials that Himmler had instructed him to receive all operational instructions for implementing the final solution from Eichmann. A new railway spur line was constructed at Auschwitz, terminating just a few hundred meters from the gas chambers. Everything was ready for mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Roundups of Hungarian Jews began on April 16, 1944. From May 14th onward, 4 trains carrying 3,000 Jews each departed Hungary daily, bound for Auschwitz. Between 10 and 25% of the people on each train were selected as forced labourers upon arrival. The rest, including the elderly, children, and those deemed unfit for work, were murdered within hours of their arrival in the gas chambers. Under international pressure, the Hungarian government halted the deportations on July 6, 1944. By that time, over 437,000 of Hungary's 725,000 Jews had been deported. Most were sent to Auschwitz, where approximately 75% were murdered immediately upon arrival. Despite the orders to stop, Eichmann personally made arrangements for additional trains of victims to be sent to Auschwitz on July 17th and 19th. During this period, Eichmann was involved in various negotiations. In April 1944, he met with Joel Brand, a Hungarian Jew and member of the Aid and Rescue Committee. Eichmann later testified that Berlin had authorized him to propose the exchange of 1 million Jews for 10,000 trucks equipped for the Eastern Front. Nothing came of this grotesque proposal, as the Western Allies refused to consider it. In June 1944, Eichmann engaged in negotiations with Rudolf Kastner that resulted in the rescue of 1,684 people who were sent by train to safety in Switzerland in exchange for 3 suitcases full of diamonds, gold, cash and securities. This episode would later become controversial, with questions raised about why some Jews were saved while hundreds of thousands were sent to their deaths. Throughout October and November 1944, even as the war was clearly turning against Germany, Eichmann continued his murderous work. He arranged for tens of thousands of Jewish victims to be forced to march in appalling conditions from Budapest to Vienna, a distance of 210 kilometers. Many died during these death marches. According to testimony at Nuremberg, Eichmann's deputy Dieter Wisliteny stated that Eichmann told him he would leap laughing into the grave because the feeling that he had 5 million people on his conscience would be for him a source of extraordinary satisfaction. When confronted with this statement at his trial years later, Eichmann would claim he meant enemies of the Reich like the Soviets, but he later admitted under questioning from the judges that he meant Jews, and that the remark accurately reflected his opinion at the time. On December 24, 1944, Eichmann fled Budapest just before Soviet forces encircled the capital. He returned to Berlin, where he arranged for the incriminating records of Department 4B4 to be burned. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Eichmann and his family were living in relative safety in Austria. Escape and exile. At war's end, Adolf Eichmann found himself in US custody, captured along with many other SS officers. But Eichmann was using forged papers that identified him as Otto Eckmann, and his true identity was not immediately discovered. He was held in several camps for SS officers, and his captors had no idea they were holding one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. In 1946, Eichmann escaped from a work detail at Cham, Germany, when he realized his identity had been discovered. He obtained new identity papers under the name Otto Henninger and spent the next several years moving frequently across Germany. He initially found work in the forestry industry and later leased a small plot of land in Altensalzkoth in the Lüneburg Heath, where he lived until 1950. Meanwhile, at the Nuremberg trials of major war criminals, which began in 1946, former Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Höss and others gave damning testimony about Eichmann's role in the Holocaust. The world was learning the name Adolf Eichmann, and he was being recognized as one of the chief perpetrators of genocide. Yet Eichmann himself remained free. In 1948, Eichmann obtained a landing permit for Argentina through an organization directed by Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric and Nazi sympathizer residing in Italy. The documents were issued under the name Riccardo Clement. These papers enabled him to obtain an international committee of the Red Cross humanitarian passport and the remaining entry permits needed to emigrate to Argentina. Eichmann travelled across Europe, staying in a series of monasteries that had been set up as safe houses for fleeing Nazis. The Catholic Church's complicity in helping Nazi war criminals escape justice remains one of the darker chapters of the post-war period. On June the 17th, 1950, Eichmann departed from Genoa by ship and arrived in Buenos Aires on July 14th. Argentina had become a haven for Nazi war criminals. The government of Juan Perón was sympathetic to former Nazis, and Argentina had a history of rejecting extradition requests for wanted war criminals. For Eichmann, it must have seemed like the perfect refuge. Initially, Eichmann lived in Tucumán province, working for a government contractor. In 1952, feeling secure enough, he sent for his wife Vera and their 3 sons. The family moved to Buenos Aires, where Eichmann held a series of low-paying jobs until he found employment at Mercedes-Benz, eventually rising to the position of department head. The family built a house at 14 Garibaldi Street in the suburb of San Fernando and moved in during 1960. For 10 years, Ricardo Clement lived an ordinary life. He went to work, came home to his family, and seemed to be just another German immigrant trying to build a life in South America. But in the late 1950s, events were set in motion that would bring his comfortable exile to an end. Between late 1956 and early 1957, Eichmann was extensively interviewed by Willem Sassen, a Dutch Nazi journalist living in Argentina. The interviews were intended to form the basis of a biography. Eichmann produced tapes, transcripts, and handwritten notes, speaking freely about his role in the Holocaust. In these interviews, Eichmann confessed openly, "I didn't care about the Jews deported to Auschwitz, whether they lived or died. It was the Führer's order. Jews who were fit to work would work, and those who weren't would be sent to the final solution." When Sassen asked if final solution meant extermination, Eichmann replied simply, "Yes." The Hunt. While Eichmann lived his quiet life in Buenos Aires, several people were dedicating themselves to finding him and bringing him to justice. Chief among these was Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor who had become a Nazi hunter. In 1953, Wiesenthal learned from a letter that Eichmann had been seen in Buenos Aires. He passed this information to the Israeli consulate in Vienna in 1954, but initially nothing came of it. The information was fragmentary, and there was no way to confirm Eichmann's exact location. Another key figure in exposing Eichmann was Lothar Hermann, a German Jew who had emigrated to Argentina in 1938. In 1956, Hermann's daughter Sylvia began dating a young man named Klaus Eichmann, who boasted about his father's Nazi exploits. Hermann was suspicious and sent his daughter on a fact-finding mission to the Eichmann home. When she arrived, she was met at the door by an older man who claimed to be Klaus's uncle. But when Klaus arrived shortly after, he addressed the man as father. Hermann contacted Fritz Bauer, the prosecutor general of the state of Hesse in West Germany. Bauer was a Jewish judge who had survived the Nazi period and was committed to bringing war criminals to justice. However, Bauer lacked trust in the German police and legal system. He feared they might be infiltrated by former Nazis who would tip off Eichmann. In 1957, Bauer made the decision to bypass the German authorities entirely. He travelled to meet with Issa Harel, the director of Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, and personally conveyed the information about Eichmann's location. Harel assigned operatives to conduct surveillance, but initially they found no concrete evidence. Another source of information was Gerhard Klammer, a German geologist who had worked with Eichmann in the early 1950s. Klammer supplied Bauer with Eichmann's address and photograph. The pieces were falling into place. On March 1, 1960, Harel dispatched Zvi Aharoni, Shin Bet's chief interrogator, to Buenos Aires. After several weeks of careful investigation, Aharoni confirmed Eichmann's identity. The man living as Ricardo Clement at 14 Garibaldi Street was indeed Adolf Eichmann, one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals in the world. Given Argentina's history of protecting Nazi fugitives, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion made a bold decision. Rather than file an extradition request that would almost certainly be rejected, Israel would capture Eichmann and bring him to Jerusalem to stand trial. It was a violation of Argentine sovereignty, but Ben-Gurion believed that justice for the Holocaust victims took precedence over diplomatic niceties. Issa Harel arrived in Buenos Aires in May 1960 to oversee the operation personally. Rafi Eitan was appointed as the leader of an 8-man team consisting mostly of Shin Bet agents. They had arrived in April and spent weeks observing Eichmann's routine, noting that he arrived home from work by bus at approximately the same time every evening. The agents confirmed his identity through covert photographs, comparing the shape of Ricardo Clement's ears to images in Eichmann's SS file. They planned to seize him as he walked from the bus stop to his house alongside an open field. Capture. The evening of May 11, 1960, was the designated day for the operation. The Mossad team waited nervously as Eichmann's usual bus arrived, but he was not on it. The plan seemed to be falling apart. Should they abort and try again another day? Then, about half an hour later, Eichmann got off a different bus. The team sprang into action. Mossad agent Peter Malkin approached him, asking in Spanish if he had a moment. Eichmann was frightened and tried to leave, but 2 more Mossad agents came to Malkin's aid. The 3 men wrestled Eichmann to the ground. After a brief struggle, they moved him to a waiting car, concealing him on the floor under a blanket. Eichmann was taken to one of several safe houses that the Mossad team had prepared. He was held there for 9 days, while his identity was definitively confirmed. During this time, Issa Harel tried to locate Joseph Mengele, the notorious Nazi doctor from Auschwitz, as Mossad had information that he was also living in Buenos Aires. Harel hoped to capture both men and bring them to Israel on the same flight. But Mengele had already left his last known residence, and Harel had no further leads. The plans to capture Mengele were abandoned, a missed opportunity that Holocaust survivors would always regret. Near midnight on May 20th, 1960, Eichmann was sedated by an Israeli anesthetist who was part of the Mossad team and dressed as a flight attendant. The team had prepared a fake Israeli passport and El Al identity card, using Eichmann's photograph and the name Ziv Zikroni. He was smuggled out of Argentina aboard the same El Al Bristol Britannia aircraft that had carried Israel's delegation to Argentina for the official 150th anniversary celebration of the May Revolution. There was a tense delay at the airport while the flight plan was approved. Every minute of waiting increased the risk that the operation would be discovered. Finally, the plane took off, making a refueling stop in Dakar, Senegal, before continuing to Israel. The Mossad agents must have felt an enormous sense of relief as the aircraft left Argentine airspace. The plane arrived in Israel on May 22, 1960. The following afternoon, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion made a dramatic announcement to the Knesset, Israel's parliament.
נתגלה על ידי שירותי המודיעין בישראל אחד מגדולי פושעי הנאצים, Adolf Eichmann.
The news sent shockwaves around the world. In Argentina, it triggered a violent wave of anti-Semitism carried out by far-right elements. The Argentine government was furious about the violation of their sovereignty and requested an urgent meeting of the United Nations Security Council. In June 1960, after unsuccessful negotiations with Israel, Argentina brought the matter before the UN Security Council. Israeli Representative Golda Meir, who would later become Prime Minister, claimed that the abductors were not Israeli agents but private individuals, meaning the incident was only an isolated violation of Argentine law. Few believed this explanation, but it provided a diplomatic fig leaf. On June 23rd, the Security Council passed a resolution agreeing that Argentine sovereignty had been violated and requesting that Israel make reparations. On August 3rd, Israel and Argentina issued a joint statement admitting the violation of Argentine sovereignty but agreeing to end the dispute. The capture of Eichmann caused alarm not only in Argentina but also at the CYA and West German intelligence services. Documents declassified in 2006 revealed that both organizations had known for at least 2 years that Eichmann was hiding in Argentina, but they had not acted. Their concern was not justice for Holocaust victims, but Cold War politics. They worried about what Eichmann might reveal about West German officials, particularly Hans Globke, who had co-authored anti-Semitic Nazi laws and was now serving as a national security advisor. Both agencies had also used former Nazi officers as intelligence assets in their operations against communist countries. The trial. Adolf Eichmann was taken to a fortified police station at Yagur in Israel, where he spent 9 months before his trial began. The Israelis were determined that this would not be a trial based solely on documents and witness testimony. Eichmann was subjected to daily interrogations by Chief Inspector Avner Less of the National Police. The transcripts of these interrogations totaled over 3,500 pages. Using documents provided primarily by Yad Vashem and Nazi hunter Tuvia Friedman, Less was often able to determine when Eichmann was lying or being evasive. When confronted with evidence, Eichmann would admit to certain actions but insist he had no authority in the Nazi hierarchy and was only following orders. Less noted that Eichmann did not seem to realize the enormity of his crimes and showed no remorse. The trial itself began on April 11, 1961, before a special tribunal of the Jerusalem District Court. The legal basis was the 1950 Nazis and Nazi collaborators punishment law, under which Eichmann was indicted on 15 criminal charges, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against the Jewish people, and membership in criminal organizations. The trial was presided over by 3 judges, Moshe Landau, Benjamin Halavi, and Yitzhak Rave. The chief prosecutor was Israeli Attorney General Gideon Hausner, assisted by Deputy Attorney General Gabriel Bach and Tel Aviv District Attorney Yaakov Bar Or. The defense team consisted of German lawyer Robert Savatius, legal assistant Dieter Wechtenbruch, and Eichmann himself. The Israeli government arranged for prominent media coverage. Capital Cities Broadcasting Corporation obtained exclusive rights to videotape the proceedings for television broadcast. Major newspapers from around the globe sent reporters and published front-page coverage. The trial was held at Beit Ham, an auditorium in central Jerusalem. Eichmann sat inside a bulletproof glass booth to protect him from assassination attempts. The building was modified to allow journalists to watch on closed-circuit television, and 750 seats were available in the auditorium. The prosecution presented its case over 56 days, involving hundreds of documents and 112 witnesses. Many of these witnesses were Holocaust survivors, and their testimony was emotionally devastating. Attorney General Hausner's strategy was not merely to prove Eichmann's guilt, but to present comprehensive material about the entire Holocaust, creating a historical record. His opening address began, "It is not an individual that is in the dock at this historic trial, and not the Nazi regime alone, but anti-Semitism throughout history." The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution proved that Eichmann had visited extermination sites, including Chelmno, Auschwitz, and Minsk, where he witnessed a mass shooting of Jews. He was fully aware that the deportees were being murdered. Documents and testimony showed his central role in organizing the logistics of genocide, from the Wannsee Conference through the deportations from across Europe to the final catastrophe in Hungary. The defense's strategy was to portray Eichmann as a minor functionary who was simply following orders. Throughout his testimony, Eichmann insisted he had no choice but to obey, as he was bound by an oath of loyalty to Hitler. This was the same superior orders defense that had been used by defendants at the Nuremberg trials. Eichmann claimed that the decisions had been made not by him, but by Müller, Heydrich, Himmler, and ultimately Hitler. But the evidence contradicted this portrayal. Eichmann had not been a passive bureaucrat. He had shown initiative, enthusiasm, and innovation in pursuing the genocide. He had overcome obstacles, secured scarce resources, and exceeded his orders. When transportation was unavailable, he found ways to make it available. When deportations were supposed to stop, he arranged for more trains. He had learned Hebrew and Yiddish to better deal with his victims. This was not the behavior of a reluctant functionary. Regarding the Wannsee Conference, Eichmann stated that he felt a sense of satisfaction and relief at its conclusion, as a clear decision to exterminate the Jews had been made by his superiors. The matter was out of his hands, and he felt absolved of guilt. On the last day of his examination, he stated that he was guilty of arranging the transports, but he did not feel guilty for the consequences. Throughout his cross-examination, Prosecutor Hausner attempted to get Eichmann to admit personal guilt, but no such confession was forthcoming. Eichmann admitted to not liking the Jews and viewing them as adversaries, but stated that he never thought their annihilation was justified. When Hausner produced evidence that Eichmann had said in 1945 that he would leap laughing into his grave with 5 million people on his conscience, Eichmann initially claimed he meant enemies of the Reich like the Soviets. Under questioning by the judges, he admitted he meant Jews, and that the remark accurately reflected his opinion at the time. The trial adjourned on August 14, 1961, and the verdict was read on December the 12th. Eichmann was convicted on all 15 counts: crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against the Jewish people, and membership in criminal organizations. The judges declared him not guilty of personally killing anyone and not guilty of overseeing the Einsatzgruppen, but they found him responsible for the conditions on the deportation trains and for obtaining Jews to fill those trains. He was convicted for crimes against Jews, Poles, Slovenes, and Roma people. When considering the sentence, the judges concluded that Eichmann had not merely been following orders. He believed in the Nazi cause wholeheartedly and had been a key perpetrator of the genocide. On December 15, 1961, Adolf Eichmann was sentenced to death. Appeals and execution. Eichmann's defense team appealed the verdict to the Israeli Supreme Court. The appeal was heard by a 5-judge panel consisting of Supreme Court President Yitzhak Olshan and judges Shimon Agranat, Moshe Zilberg, Yoel Zussman, and Alfred Witkon. The defense relied primarily on legal arguments about Israel's jurisdiction and the legality of the laws under which Eichmann was charged. Appeal hearings took place between March the 22nd and 29th, 1962. Eichmann's wife Vera flew to Israel and saw him for the last time at the end of April 1962. On May 29th, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal and upheld the district court's judgment on all counts. There would be no legal reprieve for Adolf Eichmann. Immediately after the Supreme Court decision, Eichmann petitioned Israeli President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi for clemency. Defense attorney Savatius submitted a request for clemency and petitioned for a stay of execution pending planned appeals for extradition to the West German government. Eichmann's wife and brothers also wrote to Ben-Zvi requesting clemency. Some public figures spoke against applying the death penalty. Hugo Bergman, Pearl S. Buck, Martin Buber, and Ernst Simon all voiced their opposition to executing Eichmann, but their voices were in the minority. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion called a special cabinet meeting to resolve the issue. The cabinet decided to recommend to President Ben-Zvi that Eichmann not be granted clemency. Ben-Zvi accepted this recommendation and rejected the clemency petition. At around 7 p.m. on May 31, 1962, Eichmann ate his last meal with a bottle of wine. At 8 p.m., he was informed that the appeal for presidential clemency had been denied. The execution was scheduled for midnight. Eichmann was hanged at a prison in Ramla. The execution was slightly delayed and took place a few minutes past midnight on June 1st, 1962. It was attended by a small group of officials, 4 journalists, and a Canadian clergyman named William Lovell Hull, who had served as Eichmann's spiritual counselor while in prison. Eichmann's last words were reported to be, "Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. These are the 3 countries with which I have been most connected and which I will not forget. I greet my wife, my family, and my friends. I am ready. We'll meet again soon, as is the fate of all men. I die believing in God." Rafi Eitan, the Mossad operative who had led the capture team and accompanied Eichmann to the gallows, later claimed to have heard Eichmann mumble, "I hope that all of you will follow me," making those his actual final words, a chilling statement that seemed to predict continued anti-Semitism and violence against Jews. The execution was carried out by a prison guard named Shalom Nagar. Within hours, Eichmann's body was cremated. His ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea, outside Israeli territorial waters, by an Israeli Navy patrol boat. There would be no grave, no memorial, no place for neo-Nazis to make pilgrimages. Adolf Eichmann was erased from the earth as completely as he had tried to erase the Jewish people. Adolf Eichmann remains the only person ever executed by the State of Israel. The death penalty still exists in Israeli law for crimes against humanity and crimes against the Jewish people, but it has never been applied to anyone else. Eichmann's execution was not revenge, but justice, a statement that some crimes are so monstrous that they demand the ultimate penalty. The trial's impact. The Eichmann trial had profound and lasting effects that extended far beyond the fate of one man. It fundamentally changed how the world understood and remembered the Holocaust, and its impact continues to resonate more than 60 years later. For the State of Israel, which was only 13 years old when Eichmann was captured, the trial served multiple purposes. It was an act of justice for the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. It was also an assertion of Jewish sovereignty and power. Never again would Jews be helpless victims. Israel had the capability to hunt down those who committed crimes against the Jewish people, bring them to justice, and hold them accountable. This message resonated not only with Holocaust survivors, but with Jews worldwide.